Hi there, and welcome to the next in our Intro to Web Dev course series of videos. So far we've learned quite a bit. We've learned HTML, CSS, and a bunch of JavaScript, and this video kind of continues that trend, and we're going to learn about a concept and a function that is really powerful and really unlocks quite a few things, and that is the fetch function. So I'm just going to dive right into it, I think. I'll say very generally, the sort of concept that we're going to learn about is something called AJAX. So if you want to do more research on that, type it into a search engine and you can read all about it. Maybe type JavaScript AJAX just to make sure you're looking at the right thing. But AJAX is a concept that lets you build your page in a different way, and that's kind of vague. So maybe I'll start with saying that AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which is kind of a goofy name, honestly. Like XML is not really used anymore, but it's in the name anyway, for whatever historic reasons, I guess. But AJAX lets you do a lot of things involving like requesting data from other websites and getting content from other URLs and that kind of thing, and then using that content in your page. And that might sound really scary, but the good news is that in modern JavaScript, it's really just one function. It's called the fetch function. And so I'm going to run through the fetch function now. Okay, so I have a replit over here, and I think I'm going to use this environment for now. You can do the same thing from a local file, but I'm going to use replit just for the sake of kind of showing you different environments. So I've got an index.html page, and really the only thing it does is show hello world, and the other thing it does is load script.js, which right now I think is empty. Yep, it's empty. So all I really have right now is the hello world in the page. Okay, so I'm going to build it out from there, just to get like an environment working. So maybe I'm going to have an onload function in my body. Maybe I'll call it something like show message or show greeting. Maybe that's what I'm eventually going to want to do. And then I'll define that over in script.js. So function show greeting. And my end goal is to show a greeting in this page. So for now, maybe I'll put a p tag with an ID of, I don't know, greeting, I guess. And right now it'll just be empty. Whoops, empty. So I'm going to run that, and nothing should change and nothing should break. Okay, all good. And so now I can kind of build it out from there. So what I can do is maybe I'll say let greeting element equals document.get element by ID. And what did I call it? Greeting. And this is going to get really annoying because my screen is super tiny so that you can see the letters a little better, but that means that I don't have a lot of horizontal room to work with, but we'll see how it goes. And then maybe I'll say greeting element dot inner text equals hello. Maybe while I'm here, I'll just change hello world to this is the page content, just to kind of separate it from the greeting, which will say something like hello. All right, so let me run all this, see what happens. All right, so I've got this is the page content, and I've got my greeting. And this so far uses all of the concepts that we've already seen. We're doing DOM manipulation, which again is just a fancy word for messing around with the HTML in JavaScript. And we are setting the text equal to a string. But now let's say that I wanted to get this greeting from somewhere else. And I have prepared a couple files ahead of time just to make this a little easier. So I've got this URL, which is just a URL. It's nothing fancy. It's not anything too different from anything that you've seen before. It's literally a file that's just on the internet using the same techniques that we used before. This could be a GitHub Pages site. In fact, behind the scenes, it actually is a GitHub Pages site, but you know, you don't have to worry too much about that. It's just a URL on the internet, and it has this content. Welcome to my website. And what I want to do is take the content of this URL and somehow get it in my JavaScript and add it to my page here. And, you know, spoiler alert, this maybe doesn't shock you. The way I'm going to do that is with the fetch function. So, I don't know, a couple ways to do this. You know, if you're not familiar with the fetch function, you know, you probably aren't if you're watching this video. But you can always check like MDN and W3 schools. So if I do a search for JavaScript fetch, you know, you're going to get a ton of examples and tutorials and references, and you know, I would recommend reading through all of those things if you want more information. But I'm going to kind of just go for it and see what happens. So what I'm going to do is maybe I'll move some of this to the bottom. Sure. And what I'll say is let URL equals, and I'll save the URL into a variable just to make it a little easier to work with. Whoops. Want that in a string. And again, it's kind of goofy formatting because it's just so long, but you know, it's just a single line of code that creates a variable and sets it equal to a string. The string happens to be a URL, but you know, nothing too magical yet. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to call the fetch function, and I'm going to store the value that it returns. So I'm going to say let maybe response equals fetch URL. So I'm calling the fetch function and I'm passing it a parameter, and that parameter is the URL variable, which contains this string, which is a URL. The fetch function is going to return something. We haven't actually talked about what that returns yet, but I'm storing it in this response variable. And just to see what happens, I'm going to maybe use that up here, down here, and I'm going to say greeting element.innerText equals response. Okay, I'm going to save that and I'm going to run. And you know, maybe I'll pause here and say, if you're watching this video, maybe think to yourself, like, what do you expect this to do? What do you think this will do? And I'm going to run it. And what I see is that response is this kind of weird looking square bracket object promise nonsense. It's certainly not the text of the page. And, you know, it's not something that we probably want to display to users. And this gets at something that I honestly, I found it super confusing the first million times I saw it, but I'm going to try to explain it. The reason that it's showing object promise is because the fetch function is what we call asynchronous. And asynchronous is honestly too long of a word, but compare it to a synchronous function, like not asynchronous function, but a space synchronous function, which is what the functions you've seen so far. So everything like document.get element by ID, the other functions that you've used in previous weeks, those all like happen as soon as you call them, and you read your code line by line, and the code happens in the order that you write it in. The fetch function is a little different because it's not synchronous, therefore it's asynchronous, which means that it doesn't happen when you call it, which is a little confusing, a little complicated. But the reason it happens this way, or the reason it doesn't happen right away, is because your browser doesn't know how long it's going to take to go get this URL. You know, in our case, it's going to be pretty quick because it's just a static file. But you know, if you're on a slow internet connection, for example, or if you're fetching a really big file, or if you're fetching something that takes a long time to complete, this call will take a long time. You know, if you've ever been like waiting for a page to load on like a slow internet connection, like on your phone or whatever, you probably have felt that pain. And JavaScript does not want to feel that pain because if it waits for that long-running thing to complete, your browser will basically freeze for that time. So let's say fetch takes 30 seconds to complete. You don't want your browser to be frozen for 30 seconds. You want your code to be able to keep running and doing things and like responding to user input and all that stuff. So the fetch function goes off and does the request. And what it actually returns, because this part of the code is still running, what it returns is what's called a promise. And if you want more information, type in JavaScript promises or JavaScript promise, and it's a concept that's really well documented, and you can get a ton more information if you want more details about how it works kind of behind the scenes. But for our purposes, you just need to know that a promise is not a value that you can use itself. It's a value that lets you interact with the result of something after it's done. So after that long running process completes, in this case, after it has finished fetching the content at a URL. And so honestly, the rest of this video is going to be a big list of different ways to interact with promises. I personally recommend watching through each one, because they kind of build up, and I'll go in kind of the order that it was kind of developed and introduced into JavaScript. But if I'm being honest, you probably don't need to worry about each and every one. So if you want to skip ahead to when I start talking about either arrow functions or async and await, honestly, that's probably all you'll need to know to write your own code. But if you want more information about how it works behind the scenes, that's kind of what I'm going to talk about now. So up to you. All right, so we know that we have a promise, and we know that we need to do something with that promise to work with the value that we get after the request is sent and the response comes back. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this to response promise, because it's not actually response yet, it's a response promise. So it's a promise for the response, if that makes sense. You can think of it as a value that's saying, I promise I will give you a response, but not yet. So we need to do something. And the first thing I'll introduce is the idea of callback functions. So we need to do something with the response. So maybe I'll write a new function called, I don't know, process response maybe, and it'll take a response parameter, and then I'll do something in here. Okay, so I'm going to maybe move some of this eventually, but here's what I'll do. I'll say to use a callback function with a promise, you want to call the promise's then function and pass it in the name of another function. So I'll do that, response promise dot then, and then as the argument or parameter, I'm going to give it the name of another function. So process response. And this syntax might look a little goofy, and specifically notice that I'm not actually calling the process response function myself. If I was doing that, it would look like this. Or I would, maybe pass it something in here for as the parameter. But I'm not doing that. I'm not including the parentheses after process response, because I'm not actually calling process response myself. I'm using the name of the function and passing it in as a parameter to the then function of the promise. So this is saying, hey JavaScript, hey code, call the fetch function and store the promise that the fetch function returns in this variable called response promise. Now that I have that promise, I'm going to call its then function, pass it a callback function, which is the name of another function. Now, all of that to say, that means that when the promise finishes or resolves, JavaScript will automatically call whatever function you passed in here with the actual response. So no longer promise, but the actual response. So let me move this code down, I think. And maybe I'll do this, response. Okay, So now I'm getting the element and I am setting the inner text to the response. So I'm going to save this, I'm going to run. And this is still maybe not what you would expect because I'm still getting this object response. So what this is telling me is the response is itself an object. And so I need to somehow do something with it to actually get the content of the response. So again, you can read all about the underlying mechanisms of JavaScript fetch. Let's see. So here, and you can, get tons more information about exactly how all of this stuff fits together. But I think for our purposes, what I'll just say is that the response object contains a few functions that we care about, and the one I'm going to focus on right now is the text function. So if I call response.text, this is getting, well, we're going to talk about this in a second, but this is calling the text function on the response object, which will give me, in theory, text. But let's see what happens if I actually try to use that. So I'm going to use text here instead. I'm going to save this and run it. And okay, we're back to a promise. So this is a little annoying, honestly. I don't love that this is the way that this works because honestly it's confusing. But long story short, the text function, which is a function on the response, itself returns a promise. Itself is asynchronous. And the reason for this is, in theory, this response itself could be really long, really, really, really long. And it might take a while to read all of the content from that response. And so it returns a promise for the same reason that the fetch function returns a promise, because we don't want to freeze up the browser as we wait for it to read all of that content. So we need to do the exact same thing we did before. We need to create a callback function. So I'm going to make a function down here, call it, maybe I'll say process text, and I'll take text as my argument. And now I'll move this down here and I'll use it as a callback function. So I'll say text dot then process text. And I'll actually rename this to text promise just to keep it kind of straight in my brain. Text promise dot then process text. I need to spell process right. Okay. So now the way this code works is I call the fetch function for this URL, which gives me a promise for a response. On that promise, I call the then function, and I pass it a callback function, which is the name of another function called process response. Okay, so when that process completes, which happens whenever the browser request has come back and you actually have the response, JavaScript will call process response with the response as a parameter or an argument. Okay, so now we have the response, and now I call the text function on it, which returns a promise because it's asynchronous. And so I do the same thing. I use a different callback function called process text, and I call the promises then function, passing it that callback function. Finally, in the last process text in this function, I take the text parameter, and then I use that to set the greeting in my page. Okay, let's see what happens. And there we go. There's victory. It's kind of a lot of steps, honestly, just to get some content in a page, but this is kind of what you need to do if you are not using any of the tricks I'm about to talk about. It's the idea of calling an asynchronous function and then using callback functions to get the results as those asynchronous functions complete, and then run those callback functions to do something. In this case, we're going to add it to the page. So the next thing I'll talk about is, ways to shorten this code, or ways to make this code a little bit easier to read. So right now, what happens is you call the show greeting function, and then you call fetch, and then you pass it a callback function, and then you have to read this function to understand exactly what it's doing, which itself calls a callback function, and then you have to read this, and you're 3 levels down the function call stack, it's called. And it's just kind of annoying to think about, and it's kind of hard to follow, and it's just not fun. So one trick you can do is, instead of using the promise in these functions, or in this function specifically, you can return it. So I'm going to return it, and so now the process response function itself returns a promise. Which sounds confusing, but it means that instead of using a callback function, I am taking the promise that the response.text function returns, and I am returning it back to this show greeting function, which lets me do this. And this is called promise chaining, because you are taking a promise and then you are chaining a series of callback functions. So you say then process response, and you call that. And since itself returns a promise, you can then call then again without worrying about storing a variable or anything like that. And in fact, we can shorten this even further by saying call the fetch function directly, and I don't need to store it in a variable since I don't actually reuse it anywhere. And now you have it in these this shorter syntax. And let's run this and see what I broke. Okay, I didn't break anything, shocking. So this is a shorter way to structure your code. It's maybe a little easier to understand because you can kind of stay in this show greeting function. You can say first fetch the URL, and you read it kind of like English, then process the response, which calls the text function, and then when you have the text, call process text, which takes the text and does the same thing that we did before. So this is something called promise chaining, and it's better. And well, I leave it up to you to decide whether it's better. Honestly, it's kind of subjective. I kind of like it better, but this is one step further into shortening your code, which whatever. It's not always better to shorten your code, but if you find this more readable, then I say go for it. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is more ways to shorten this code, honestly. So notice that the process response function and the process text function, they're only called once, and they're called as parameters to another function, to the then function. And in this case, what you'll see pretty often is a concept or an approach called anonymous functions. So before I explain what that is, maybe I'll just mention that the functions you've seen so far are named functions because literally they have names. This function has a name, and you can use that name by either calling it directly or passing it around as a callback function parameter. So this other type of function is called an anonymous function, and you can use them, they're handy whenever you have a case like this where you have defined a function for really the only reason you have it is so that you can use it as a callback function. So I'm going to have an anonymous function by using the function keyword here, and it's going to take a parameter called response, and I'm going to use open curly bracket and a close curly bracket, and I'll give myself some white space, and here I'll return response.text. I'm pretty much just stealing this directly from our previous process response function, so I can delete that now. And I can do the same thing here, function text, and then I can steal this code, move that up here, and delete the named function. So let me play with my white space a little bit, just to make it a little bit more readable, and sure. So this might look a little goofy. It probably looks a little goofy. Looks a little goofy to me, honestly. But what this is doing is it's calling the then function exactly like we were doing before, but we are passing it a function that we don't actually give a name. We just use it directly. You can kind of think of this as, I don't know, like if you have a function that takes a number, you can say like let number equals 7, and then you can call a function with, I don't know, do something with number, giving it a name. You can also just give it the value directly if you don't need the variable. So I think of it similar to that, where this is kind of like a function value, and you can use it without giving it a name, exactly like you can use any other value without giving a name. Again, it looks a little weird, I admit that, but you'll see this pretty often in sort of real code. All right, so let me run that and see what I broke. And okay, cool, miracle. Nothing is broken yet. So this is, it's getting shorter. And, again, whether you think it's more readable or not, I leave up to you, and you're free to use whatever approach you prefer, but you'll see this pretty often in the wild. Okay, one more step in our journey to improving this code. These are anonymous functions, and they work, and you'll see them a lot, but there's actually a newer syntax for this. In, I think, 2015, this was introduced, this new feature of JavaScript, and it's called arrow functions. And so again, like if there's ever anything that I say that you want more information on, like because you can't like literally raise your hand and ask me, I recommend, typing them into your search engine. So you can get more information about arrow functions on the internet. MDN, W3 Schools are old friends. But I'll just kind of demonstrate how they work. Basically, you can delete the function keyword and then use an arrow. And if your function is one line of code that returns something, then you actually can delete a lot of other things. You can delete the return statement, and you can delete the curly bracket. So it gets a lot shorter. So this is now an arrow function, which is an anonymous function, but with kind of the cleaner syntax using the new and improved arrow function functionality. And I'll do something similar here. Because this is 2 lines of code that doesn't actually return anything, I have to keep around the curly bracket, so this doesn't actually get much shorter, but you can at least delete the function keyword. So again, this gets maybe more readable. I don't want to tell you whether you think it's more readable or not, but this is kind of the way you'll see it a lot in sort of the wild. So now we can read our code by saying we have a URL, we call the fetch function, then we call the text function on that response, then we take that text and we add it to the page. Okay, so that is arrow functions, and I would say, like, if you prefer this syntax, then that's completely valid. But there's actually kind of an alternative way to deal with promises. Again, all of this was just kind of different ways to deal with promises. And now I'll talk about one last way to do that, which involves like thinking about them a little differently. So this is also a new feature of JavaScript. This was introduced in 2017, and that is the async and await keywords. So we talked about asynchronous and synchronous functions before, or a few minutes ago, and by default every function is synchronous. If I write function show greeting, that means that function show greeting will run as soon as it's called and will work the way that every other function that you've seen so far has worked. But I can now, as of 2017, use the async keyword, and this tells JavaScript that the show greeting function should be run asynchronously, basically in the background is the way I think about it, which is not quite right, but it's good enough for our purposes. So now when JavaScript calls the async function, it doesn't necessarily run right away, it is called asynchronously. And now that we have declared that our function is asynchronous, we can work with these promises a little bit differently. So I'm going to make myself some room here, and what I'm going to do is declare a variable, and I'm going to call it response, and I'm going to set it equal to await fetch. And I spelled await wrong, but await fetch. And here's the power of the asynchronous function or async keyword. What I am telling JavaScript is, okay, call the fetch function, which itself is asynchronous, which generally means that it'll return a promise. In fact, it still does return a promise. But instead of continuing to, read every line of code and execute it in order, just wait. Just wait for that promise to come back with the actual response. And so this gets a little bit closer to maybe how you would have expected it to work from the get out. And the reason you're allowed to do this is because our show greeting function itself is asynchronous. So you are no longer blocking the browser while it waits for stuff. This is happening sort of behind the scenes and not blocking any other code. So anyway, now I have my response, and I can do kind of the exact same thing that I already did and say await response.text. So this is very similar to this line where now I have the response and I want to call the text function on it, which is asynchronous, but instead of using a callback function or an arrow function or whatever, I am just saying, hey JavaScript, just wait for it. Just let me know when it's done, and then I'll keep trucking. Which means that you can delete all this extra syntax. So, and again, I'm going to kind of leave it up to you to decide what you think is easiest to understand. But this is another common way you'll see the fetch function kind of worked with async and await. So let me run this and see if that actually works. And it does. So, just read it line by line. So we define a show greeting function and we tell JavaScript that it's asynchronous, which means that it runs kind of in the background. We create a URL variable, and then we call fetch with that URL as a parameter, and we tell JavaScript to wait for that promise, which we are allowed to do because we're in an async function. We get that response back, and we call the text function on that response, which reads the text from it. And we tell JavaScript, again, just wait for it. Don't make me do any callback function stuff, and set the text variable equal to that. And then we add that text variable to the page here. So there you go. That was a bunch of different ways to play with the fetch function. We went through a bunch of different things: callback functions, promise chaining, anonymous functions, arrow functions, and now async and await. And now you have the power to get content from other places, other URLs, and do stuff with it. In this case, we have added it to our web page as a greeting, but there's other stuff you can do, which I'll talk about right now, actually. Before I do that, let me think about the best way to do this. Maybe I will, can I comment all this out? Yeah. All right, I just commented it out, which just means that JavaScript's going to ignore it, and I am giving myself some white space just to kind of talk for a minute. What I want to talk about is something called JSON. And again, these are kind of keywords that you can throw at a search engine: JavaScript, JSON. And if you want to learn more, tons more resources out there. I wouldn't limit yourself to just listening to me talk. I would go off and read more as you need it. But JSON, JSON, stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a fancy word for storing data in a way that makes it easy for JavaScript to work with. And this might sound like I'm just going off on a random tangent, but I promise it comes back to the fetch function, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But for now, here's a little segue into JSON. So JSON is a set of, I don't know, formatting rules, you can think of them as, that you follow to create strings that you can then work with in JavaScript. So let me just throw an example at you. You know what an object is, so I can say like let, I don't know, person equals, and then I can use the curly braces to specify this as an object, and I can say like first name colon Ada, and maybe last name colon Lovelace there, and maybe again white space just to save my sanity. And then I can work with that. Maybe I'll say console.log person.firstname, you know, just to get something working. All of this is just test data, so it doesn't really matter, but there we go. We see Ada in the console. Now this is just regular old JavaScript. This is an object, and what I'm going to do is convert this to JSON kind of manually. And the way I'm going to do that is, first I need the whole thing to be actually, let me look. I forgot. I forgot what it needs to be. So whatever, I think I might just leave this in. All right, this is going to be, yeah, okay. Let's just see. I honestly don't know if this is going to work, but let's see. So first, what I want to do is I'm going to use double quotes here just to make my life a little easier. And then I will also use double quotes around the property names. And so actually, maybe I'll pause here and say, like, we haven't actually left regular JavaScript yet. This is actually valid JavaScript. You're allowed to put the property names in quotes if you want to. You don't have to, but in regular JavaScript, this will still work. So let me run this, and we still see Ada here. So this is just another way to define an object in JavaScript with, you know, quotation marks around them instead of single quotes, and with quotation marks around the property names as well. Valid JavaScript that will work fine. Now the thing that makes this JSON is, like, drum roll please, I'm going to make the whole thing a string. And my new line is going to fight with me, so maybe I'll get rid of my new line. Okay, so this is now a string, which, if you look inside of the string, it is JavaScript. It is an object in JavaScript. And so I can still use that variable exactly like I can use any other string variable. And I'll run this, and now we see that this is printed to the console. It's just a string, nothing too fancy. But what I can do is, now maybe I'll name this like person JSON maybe, or JSON, whatever. I can convert that back into an object. So I'll say person object maybe equals, and you know, you don't have to actually pay too close attention to this because we're going to get out of this kind of example land in a second and go back to fetch, but there's a handy JSON.parse function which takes JSON and converts it to a regular object. And now I'm back to being able to use this as an object in JavaScript. So first name. So let me run that, and I'm back to having Ada as a value I can use through this person object dot first name. So to talk about this in a little more detail, what I'm doing is I'm creating a JSON formatted string, which really is just a string that contains JavaScript. And in that JSON formatted string, I define an object, and that object has first name and last name. Okay, but person JSON itself is a string. I can't call like person JSON dot first name. It won't work. So if I call person JSON dot first name, because this is a string, strings don't have a first name property. So if I run this, I will see undefined in the console because this is not defined because it's not a property of strings. So anyway, person JSON is a string, a JSON formatted string, and then I call JSON.parse to take that string and convert it into its underlying object representation. So I take away the quotation marks basically, and I read the object that's inside of it, and then return that and store it in person object, which gives me access to the properties that are in there. And this might not seem super useful. Like, why would I format my stuff as a string and then like unformat it as a string? That seems pointless. And if we were just coding by ourselves, that's true. You're right. That's a valid criticism. Thank you for that. But the power is that this string doesn't have to come from you. This string can come from, well, pretty much anywhere. And this ties back into the fetch function because you can fetch JSON with the fetch function and then do stuff with it. Similar to how we were doing, we were using the fetch function to fetch regular old text in our previous example. Nothing stops you from using the fetch function to fetch other stuff, including JSON formatted strings. So I have another sort of file that I have prepared kind of ahead of time. So let me go to that. That's here. So again, this is kind of review for objects, but remember that objects can be nested and they can, you can have an array of objects, and objects can contain other objects and other arrays and all that good stuff. So real JSON is often, quite complicated with a bunch of nesting, but it's all just the same kinds of concepts that we've seen before in the object lessons. So this JSON, which is really just JavaScript, defines an array, and that array contains several objects, and each object contains two fields, a text field and a color field. And so let me go back to my sort of environment over here. I'll get rid of this code now. Yeah. And I'm going to put back my async and put back all my code. And all right, so maybe I'll just run this just to make sure that nothing broke. And okay, I still have my old greeting, which is because I'm fetching the text welcome.txt file, which was this one, text welcome.txt. So I'm going to change a couple things. First, I'm going to change this to whatever this one is, randomwelcomes.json. This is, it's just a URL of a file that's on the internet that you can browse to in your browser, but this by itself is not really designed for humans to read. It's designed for code to read, for JavaScript to read. So now I have that URL and I am fetching it. Now I'm going to stick with await and async and await here just because it's what I already had, but you are free to use whatever approach you prefer. So let me just run this and see what happens. So now we have, something. Now we have the content of that file embedded in our page. But like I said, this isn't really designed for humans to actually see. So I need to do a little bit more processing. I can't just use the text directly. There's a few things I could do. So first, what I could do is rely on what I showed you before, where I called the JSON.parse function. So let's, what did I call this? Maybe I'll just call it like greetings because it's an array equals JSON.parse text. And then I can say greetings and maybe just take the first one. And I think this will work. No. Oh, right. So this is an object, and I told y'all that I would stop, I would show kind of these, me making mistakes and debugging and stuff. So here we go. I just messed something up. And this is maybe not what I expected. Like, what? This is object. Like, what does this mean? Object, object. I thought it would be a greeting. So when I see an error like this, I want to go look at the actual text. So that's here. And now I kind of look at my code and I say, I'm getting greetings 0. Okay, so I look at the array and I'm getting greetings 0. And oh, right, the greetings are themselves objects which contain 2 fields, text and color. So, okay, what I actually want is greetings0.text. So this is an object. Greetings is an object which contains a text field and a color field, and maybe I should rename this to text JSON, maybe, just to make it a little bit easier to read, because this is different than this. Okay, so I get text JSON back. I parse that JSON into an array of greetings, and then I get the first object from that array, and then I reference its text field. So let's run that and see what happens. And there you go. You have welcome to my site, which comes from here. So I can change that. Maybe I'll say 1 instead. So I'll run that. And now I get a different greeting. I can keep changing this to my little heart's content. Run. And there you go. So you can do it this way. You can call json.parse with whatever text you get back, but you don't actually have to, because the fetch, the way fetch works, the response that you get back, we've been calling a text function because that's what we've used, but if you know ahead of time that your text is actually JSON, you can actually call JSON instead. And so this is no longer text, it's now the actual array. So this is doing the parsing of the JSON for us behind the scenes magically, and giving us the array. So now if I run this, nothing should change. And there you go. So this is how you can like fetch data from from anywhere, really. We're going to talk about like where to go for that data. I think I'm going to save that for another video just to break it up a little bit more. But it's only a few lines of code, and sure, there's a lot happening in each line of code, and depending on which approach to handling the promises that you went with, it might be more code, but it's pretty powerful. In 10 lines of code, what I'm doing is fetching data from another URL and doing some admittedly relatively simple processing of that data. I'm just choosing one. But you can kind of extend this to other, maybe more involved use cases where the data itself is more complicated and you're doing more complicated things with it. But the underlying concepts are: you call fetch, you deal with the response that you get back, and then based on whether it's like text or JSON or HTML, you process it, and generally you're going to add something to your page as a result. And that'll apply pretty much to any project that involves fetch, which, again, to like throw it back to the very beginning, is a way to do AJAX in modern JavaScript. Okay, I think that's about as far as I'm going to go with the sort of fundamentals of fetch. I think I'm going to save the talking about APIs for a second video. The last thing I'll mention is something that's kind of, I don't know, theoretical or maybe more conceptual, or there's a word I'm looking for that I can't quite remember. Philosophical. It's a little more philosophical, and that is like thinking in AJAX. So I won't ramble too much, but a very brief history of how the internet worked was up until about, 2006 or so. You went to an HTML file, and your browser loaded that HTML file, and that HTML file could load like CSS and JavaScript and stuff, but it was pretty much a one-to-one mapping of URL to content, and that was just how it worked. And that's pretty much how all of our projects up until now have worked. You've had an index.html file that contains some content, that, maybe had some JavaScript and CSS, but the content was all sort of loaded right at the beginning, and then your browser read through your code, line by line to create the end result web page. Then in around 2006 or so, there was something which I'm not going to get into the full history, but basically the idea of AJAX was introduced. And one of the first, websites, I guess I'll call it, that used AJAX was Gmail, actually. And I guess I won't go to Gmail and show you my email as an example, but picture Gmail. Maybe there's a screenshot of it or something. Where, oh God, that's not what I wanted. Gmail screenshot, maybe. Sure. So whatever, what Gmail looks like, or really any webmail these days, where you have, it's not an HTML file. You're not loading all of the content from a file anymore. It is HTML at the end of the day because your browser only really understands HTML, but the way Gmail works and the way most modern sites work now is the initial index.html file, or whatever .html file, doesn't really contain much data. It might contain the header at the top, maybe the left nav, some stuff that's on basically every page, but then it uses AJAX to actually get the data that is displayed in that page. So I'm using Gmail as an example because it was the first really popular thing that used AJAX, but you can imagine that the Google bar at the top, or whatever it looks like now, that's always there. So that's just in the HTML. That's it doesn't need to load that separately. That's always there. Maybe the compose button, stuff like that, that's always there. So that's probably in whatever HTML file they serve. But your actual emails, it doesn't know them ahead of time. So they can't be in the HTML that serves you. Instead, it uses AJAX to go get a list of your emails. And it comes back as, I don't actually know what it comes back as, but it could be JSON. And then the JavaScript in your browser processes that data and loads the emails into your browser, into your page there. So this is kind of the new way of thinking about websites. It's no longer just static HTML and JavaScript and CSS. Now it's this more kind of dynamic process where you don't load all the content at once because you don't have all of the content. You load just parts of the page and then kind of fill in the blanks through AJAX. So I don't know, some other examples of that, if you use, pretty much any social media, so Instagram or Twitter, or I guess the kids these days are using TikTok. You go to Twitter or TikTok or whatever, and it's not like there's an HTML file that contains every tweet. That would be a very large file, and each person looks at different accounts anyway. It follows different accounts or whatever. It's kind of specialized. So the actual index.html file that either TikTok or Twitter or Instagram serves you is pretty empty, actually. It might contain the top browser, the header or whatever, but it's not going to contain all of the tweets. But what happens is the JavaScript in that page uses AJAX to fetch the tweets or the TikToks, whatever they're called, or the Instagram post or whatever, gets them back in theory as JSON, but you don't have to use JSON, and most big companies probably have their own formatting, but whatever, it very well could be JSON, and processes it and does something like adding it to the page. So this is thinking in AJAX, I'll call it, and this is I don't know, the more modern way of thinking about it. It gets a lot more complicated than that, but I think for this week, what I would focus on is thinking about it as a new way of approaching web design or designing your web page. Maybe it doesn't make sense for you to have all of your content in your HTML ahead of time. Maybe you start using these concepts to build more dynamic things. And, I think I'm going to save the rest of that, getting into how you do that for the next video, because this one's, honestly pretty long and it's time for my dinner. Okay, that was, I think, everything that I wanted to talk about in terms of fetch. I threw a lot at you, but a lot of that was different ways to deal with the fact that fetch is asynchronous and different ways of dealing with promises. The core logic is, relatively few lines of code that does this really powerful thing. And again, the next video will talk more about now what do we do with this? So for now, I'll say thanks for watching. Have fun in the next video, I guess, and I'll see you over there. All right, bye.